Welcome back to this Paper Connections investigation. Today, we open the third chapter of our sprawling historical epic into the Haitian Revolution. In Episode 1, we heard the terrified words of Father Thomas. In Episode 2, we tracked the miraculous survival of his letter across a burning ocean. Now, in Episode 3, we follow a secret trail to uncover the ultimate truth about who this man really was, where the cross of the church meets the brutal economics of sugar.
Yes, and we want you to really sit at the investigative table with us for this one.
Right. Consider yourself the third historian in the room, analyzing the final pieces of this forensic puzzle with us.
Because our objective today, it shifts fundamentally.
Completely.
Right.
We are moving away from the physical improbability of how a fragile piece of rag paper from June 1797 survived the burning of a Caribbean colony.
Right. Instead, we are initiating a relentless archival hunt for its author.
Father Claude Thomas.
Exactly. And this is a trail that will lead us directly into the darkest intersections of theology and high finance.
It's a necessary shift in our focus, I think.
It absolutely is. To fully comprehend the manuscript we've been examining over the course of our investigation, we really have to comprehend the man holding the quill.
Right, the author.
We established the improbability of his letter surviving the siege of Croix de Bouquet, right? Navigating French privateers in the Windward Passage, clearing the yellow fever quarantines on the Delaware River.
Yeah, that was a journey on its own.
But the survival of the paper is only half the narrative. The lingering mystery we really must now confront is the authority of the author himself.
Who possesses the profound audacity to calmly demand 28,264 livres, which is a sum representing roughly $500,000 United States dollars in contemporary purchasing power,
Right.
on a mere handshake, while an entire empire violently collapses outside his window?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I am genuinely stuck on the mechanics of that specific demand.
I mean, how does a spiritual shepherd in a colonial parish acquire the leverage of a central banker to a plantocracy?
Well, it's a structural issue.
Because in my reading of 18th century canon law, a parish priest is meant to be a minister of sacraments, not a commercial loan officer holding unsecured debts of that magnitude.
Right, exactly.
So are we looking at a rogue actor here, or was this standard operating procedure?
We are looking at the foundational architecture of the colonial Caribbean. It wasn't rogue at all.
Interesting.
To answer your question, we really must define this archival hunt, not just as a geographical pursuit from the Caribbean to the American South, but as a forensic, financial, and religious puzzle.
Okay.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to examine the etymology of the empire itself. We must look at the physical geography.
You mean the name of the colony?
Yes. The colony we refer to as Saint-Domingue is simply the French translation of the Spanish Santo Domingo.
Which was a settlement founded on the island of Hispaniola by Bartholomew Columbus in 1493, right?
Exactly. But it wasn't just a random designation. There are layers to why Columbus chose it.
I know there's a specific historical debate about the origins of that name.
There are three overlapping historical reasons for the naming of that original settlement. First, the city was formally founded on a Sunday, which is Domingo in Spanish.
Right.
Second, it was named to honor the admiral's father, Domenico Colombo.
Ah, okay.
But the third reason is the one that anchors our entire investigation today. The name honored Saint Dominic de Guzman.
The Spanish priest who founded the Order of Preachers in the year 1216.
Yes, and that order is remembered by history as the Dominicans.
Oh, I see where this is going.
So when France formally acquired the western third of Hispaniola through the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, they simply translated the name without altering its fundamental meaning.
Santo Domingo became Saint Domingue.
Exactly, which means Father Claude Thomas, whom we know as a Dominican friar, was serving his vows, managing his ledgers and ministering to his parish in a colony that literally bore the name of the founder of his own religious order.
The symmetry is absolute.
It really is. When the Haitian Revolution dismantled that world, it dismantled, in the most literal etymological sense, the colony of Saint Dominic.
So this forces us to look at the Catholic Church not merely as an institution of spiritual guidance, but as a structural economic power.
Precisely. It was an entity deeply and systematically embedded in the transatlantic slave trade. And this involvement predated the French colonization of Saint-Domingue by centuries.
Could you elaborate on how that framework was established? I mean, how does a religious institution reconcile the brutality of human bondage with its spiritual mandate?
It's a massive contradiction.
Because I understand there were papal decrees that set the stage long before the first sugar mill was ever built in the Caribbean.
Yes, we must examine the theological architecture of extraction. The church essentially provided the moral infrastructure upon which the entire global slave trading enterprise was constructed.
Going all the way back to the 15th century.
Exactly. In 1452, decades before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversas.
And what did that decree actually do?
It granted the Portuguese crown explicit theological and legal authorization to invade, capture, and subdue non-Christians, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery.
Perpetual slavery, just explicitly stated like that.
Yes. And then 3 years later, in 1455, the Bull Romanus Pontifex expanded and codified this authorization.
Okay.
It granted Portugal a monopoly on trade in Africa and formally institutionalized the Church's blessing on the capture of African bodies.
This sounds like the formal establishment of what historians call just war theology.
It is the absolute cornerstone of it. The doctrine asserted that enslavement was justified when it issued from a war against non-Christians.
Right.
Furthermore, it argued that the horror of the Middle Passage and the violence of capture were ultimately redeemed by the gift of baptism.
So baptism was presented as the gateway to Christian salvation, essentially balancing the moral ledger in the eyes of the Church.
Exactly. We even see this internal conflict play out with figures like Bartolomé de las Casas.
De las Casas was himself a Dominican friar in the 16th century, correct?
He was, yes.
Because he is often cited as one of the earliest advocates for the indigenous peoples of the Americas.
He was. I mean, he vehemently challenged the enslavement and slaughter of the indigenous populations. But his early advocacy disastrously proposed the expanded importation of enslaved Africans to replace the dying indigenous labor force.
Oh.
He believed the Africans were hardier and their enslavement was theoretically justified under the just war doctrines he had been taught.
Right, the doctrines from those papal bulls.
He later repented this position with tremendous force, realizing the African trade was just as unjust and brutal, but the institutional framework had already been cast in iron.
The economic engine had started.
Exactly. And it required immense capital to operate.
Which brings us back to the money.
Yes.
The Caribbean was an engine room producing raw materials, sugar, coffee, indigo, but the true centers of global power resided in the financial hubs of Europe.
They did.
So in a colonial environment where hard currency was notoriously scarce, how did the religious orders fill the financial vacuum?
They operated as the primary credit providers, utilizing a financial mechanism known as the censo.
I want to make sure we understand the mechanics of the censo. Was it similar to a merchant's letter of credit or more akin to a modern mortgage?
It functioned much like a medieval tithe system adapted into a mortgage-backed loan.
Okay.
But the collateral securing these loans was not just the physical plantation estates. The collateral included the enslaved human beings whose forced labor gave that land its value.
Wow. I mean, that is a severe economic model.
It was. The church extended the credit. The planter placed a perpetual lien on his estate, and if he defaulted, the religious order foreclosed and took legal possession of the assets.
Including the human beings.
Including the human beings.
So if a planter in Croix de Bouquet needed to purchase new boiling poppers for his sugar mill or purchase more enslaved labor from a newly arrived ship, he might go to his local parish priest rather than a secular bank.
Frequently, yes.
Yeah.
It transformed the religious orders into transoceanic banking networks.
Incredible.
Before their expulsion from the French territories, the Jesuits had perfected this dual role. Consider their operations in Luanda.
Luanda in Central Africa.
Yes, the primary hub for Portuguese slave exports. The Jesuit college there operated simultaneously as a baptismal station and a commercial clearinghouse.
At the exact same location.
Enslaved people were baptized in mass ceremonies on the beaches immediately prior to being loaded into the holds of slave ships.
Unbelievable.
Concurrently, the Jesuits extended letters of credit to the very merchants whose expeditions they were blessing. This ensured the machinery of the trade never halted, even during periods of extreme monetary scarcity.
The church was simultaneously the spiritual shepherd of the enslaved and their potential owner or financier.
Yes, the dual role was constant.
But the Jesuits were expelled from Saint-Domingue before the revolution, weren't they?
They were. In 1763, the Jesuits were formally expelled from the French Caribbean.
Why was that?
This expulsion was the result of a protracted political conflict with the secular planter class and the French crown over the order's accumulated wealth and perceived institutional autonomy. The planters owed the Jesuits massive debts, and expelling them was a convenient way to eliminate the creditor.
That makes a dark kind of sense.
Following this expulsion, a royal decree transferred their immense properties and jurisdictions to the Capuchin and Dominican orders.
And this geographical transfer is what places Father Thomas directly into our narrative.
Precisely. The Dominicans, who were universally known in the local French colonial vernacular as the Jacobins, due to their original convent on the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris, took total administrative control over the western and southern provinces of the colony.
Okay, so they took over the Jesuit infrastructure.
Yes.
Yeah.
This exact geography encompasses Port-au-Prince, the Plaine de Cul-de-Sac, and the highly prosperous parishes of Léogane and Cavaillon.
I want to clarify something here. Were these jurisdictions purely spiritual, meaning they just ran the local churches, or did they actually inherit the physical plantations the Jesuits left behind?
Oh, they inherited fully functioning agro-industrial enterprises.
Really?
The Dominicans maintained massive, semi-feudal agricultural estates in Léogane and Cavaillon. These operations functioned exactly like the secular sugar and coffee plantations that surrounded them.
That is just so counter to what we think of as a monastic order.
To comprehend the scale of their operation, we look at the historical inventories compiled just before the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789.
And what do those show?
By that year, the Dominican Order owned over 1,000 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue.
Over 1,000.
Yes. They functioned as the single largest ecclesiastical slaveholder in the French West Indies.
So the chaplains who baptized the children born on these estates provided a spiritual service that, in the strict accounting of the order, justified the economic extraction the institution was simultaneously inflicting upon those same bodies.
Exactly.
When we picture Father Thomas demanding a fortune from an exiled planter, we are not looking at an anomaly. We are looking at a man executing the fundamental institutional role of the colonial church.
That is the foundation. And this leads us directly to the primary evidence we uncovered when we transitioned our search from the Caribbean to the American South.
Right, because the letters stopped and we had to follow the people.
Exactly. We traced the refugee diaspora following the collapse of Saint Dominic, and we located the St. Louis Cathedral sacramental registers in the archives of the Archdiocese of New Orleans.
Tell us about that physical space. When you are looking for a ghost from 1797, what does it actually feel like to find him in a completely different archive?
Well, you are sitting in a quiet, temperature-controlled room, far from the cane fields of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
You are carefully turning the pages of massive, leather-bound registers from the early 19th century. The paper is heavy, the ink is fading brown, and then suddenly, the phantom author of our manuscript physically materializes in the historical record.
It's an incredible moment of discovery.
It really is. I want to read the exact wording of the signature block I found. This is an entry dated December 30th, 1809.
Okay.
I am going to read it slowly because the phrasing he chooses carries the weight of an entire collapsed empire.
Go ahead.
Claude Thomas Soussinet, ancien curé de Saint-Domingue et vicaire de cette paroisse.
The undersigned Claude Thomas, former parish priest of Saint-Domingue and vicar of this parish.
Yes.
So what does this all mean?
It means that signature is definitive proof.
The priest who demanded the massive debt in 1797, the man who claimed his miseries were increasing every day and that his end was nearly come, survived the destruction of his world.
You did.
He did not perish in the ashes of the cul-de-sac. He navigated the collapse, crossed the sea, and secured a position of institutional power in the United States.
Right. And to understand how he achieved this survival, we must unravel his secret trail with meticulous detail, tracking his movements through the archival records.
We have to go back to the beginning of his career then.
Yes. We trace his formation backward. Before he was the powerful parish priest of Croix de Bouquet, historical records from the Généalogie et Histoire de la Caraïbe identify his early colonial career bearing the ecclesiastical abbreviation FR, which stands for frère or brother.
Okay, so he began as a regular member of the Dominican Order.
He did.
And his first documented posting after being elevated to the secular clergy as a curé, a parish priest, was the parish of Cavaillon.
Yes.
This is critical because you mentioned Cavaillon, located in the southern province, was the epicenter of the Dominican Order's slave-worked agricultural estates.
Right. He took his vows within an institution that owned over 1,000 human beings in that exact region.
He was the spiritual administrator of a slave economy before he was ever transferred to the elite sugar parish of Croix de Bouquet.
Exactly. And in Croix de Bouquet, he served the wealthiest sugar planting families in the colony.
The elite of the elite.
He baptized their heirs, officiated their strategic marriages, and, most importantly, heard their confessions.
Ah. Through the intimacy of the confessional, Father Thomas acquired exhaustive knowledge of the financial vulnerabilities on the plain.
Precisely.
He would know who was solvent, who was borrowing heavily against next year's crop, and who was desperate. He became the confessor and the creditor simultaneously.
Which recontextualizes the realities of the 1797 letter entirely.
How so?
When the great planter Jacques-François Turbet de Lamar was facing financial ruin, he turned to Father Thomas, who advanced him the unsecured debt of 28,264 livres.
Right, because Thomas had the capital and knew Lamar's exact situation.
And in that same letter, Thomas mentions managing an enslaved boy referred to as un petit nègre and some mules left to him free of charge for his household convenience by the late Lamar.
He equates a human child with pack animals in the same syntactical breath.
He does.
It reflects an institution that administered human beings as a matter of daily routine.
Absolutely.
But that routine was permanently dismantled by the Revolution.
In 1804, the military forces commanded by Jean-Jacques Dessalines achieved total victory. They defeated the combined colonial armies, declared the Republic of Haiti, and permanently abolished slavery on the island.
A complete upending of the colonial structure.
The physical infrastructure of the Dominican Order, their estates, their churches, their parish records spanning a century, was completely destroyed or absorbed into the new Free Republic.
So what did the clergy do?
The clergy were forced into exile, and Father Thomas fled across the Windward Passage to Oriente Province in Cuba.
I am curious about the canonical logistics of this exile.
What do you mean?
Well, when a parish priest flees a burning parish and lands in a foreign territory, what is his official standing? Can he just walk into a Spanish church and begin saying Mass?
Under standard canon law, he cannot.
Okay.
A secular parish priest, a curé, derives his authority strictly from his specific geographical jurisdiction.
So his authority is tied to the land.
Exactly. When Croix-des-Bouquets and Cavaillon ceased to exist within the French imperial framework, his authority effectively vanished.
That puts him in a very difficult spot.
To arrive in a Spanish colonial port, presenting himself as a curé without a recognized diocese, was an incredibly precarious position. He would be a refugee without portfolio.
But the records show he didn't present himself as a curé when he arrived in Cuba.
No, he did not. The transcribed Santiago de Cuba baptismal indices reveal a brilliant canonical maneuver.
What did he do?
He reappears as Father Claude Thomas.
Using the Frere abbreviation again?
Yes. He employs a reversion strategy. A Dominican friar, a frere, holds universal papal pre-colonial authority.
I see.
The Order of Saint Dominic maintained an ancient sanctioned presence throughout the Spanish Caribbean, a presence that predated the French colonization of Saint-Domingue.
So it is akin to a merchant sailing under a letter of marque when his national flag is no longer recognized.
That's a good way to look at it.
By re-anchoring his identity to his monastic vows, Father Thomas secured a legitimacy that transcended the collapsed borders of the French world. He made his authority valid in Spanish territory.
He secured his spiritual jurisdiction in Cuba, while the planter network he had served was actively reconstructing its slave economy in Oriente Province.
They were trying to rebuild what they lost.
And we know the exile network was highly organized from a letter discovered in the Jean-Baptiste Drouillard family papers.
Oh, the Drouillard network.
Yes. It is dated February 6, 1806, from Eloy La Manière in Santiago de Cuba to Jean-Baptiste Drouillard, who was already stationed in New Orleans.
So they were coordinating across the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. The correspondence meticulously discusses the management and labor of two specific enslaved individuals, Cupidon and Jeanne.
Which proves these exiles were actively rebuilding the agricultural machinery they had lost.
Yes, but this Cuban sanctuary was temporary.
Right.
The geopolitical landscape shifted again, triggering a second expulsion for these refugees.
What happened?
In October 1807, Napoleon signed the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau, which led to French troops crossing into the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay, the invasion of Spain.
By 1808, Napoleon forced the abdication of the Spanish royals at Bayonne, igniting the Peninsular War.
And the repercussions across the Atlantic were severe, right?
Very. In the spring of 1809, the Marquis de Somorelos, the Captain General of Cuba, issued a decree expelling all French nationals from the island as retaliation against the empire that was currently occupying Spain.
The Saint-Domingue diaspora was subjected to a second total dispossession.
Yes. Over 10,000 refugees flooded into the port of New Orleans between May 1809 and early 1810.
To put that influx into perspective, they doubled the population of New Orleans, which only had about 8,000 residents at the time of the Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
This massive wave included the gens de couleur libre, the free people of color who brought their wealth, artisanal skills, and complex social hierarchies to the American South.
And Father Thomas was among this massive wave of exiles.
Which brings us back to the St. Louis Cathedral records.
Exactly. We can trace his exact integration into this community through those registers.
What do we see when we look at the pages?
Let us examine the architectural layout of the archival documents he generated upon his arrival in Louisiana.
Okay.
On December 30th, 1809, mere weeks after landing, Father Thomas enters the register to record the baptism of Luce.
Luce.
Yes. Luce was born October 30, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Lise.
Right.
Lise was enslaved to Marguerite Chalet. And Marguerite Chalet is identified in the register as a free mulatress and plantation owner from Saint-Domingue, Saint-Domingue.
So Father Thomas is immediately operating within the complex, stratified layers of the refugee community.
He is. And just 2 days later, on January 1st, 1810, he records the baptism of Françoise Courtin.
Who are her parents?
The parents are Jacques Courtin and Marianne Fronde, explicitly identified as inhabitants of Cavaillon.
His old parish.
Exactly. And the godparents are Jean-Baptiste Lefebvre and Dame Françoise Leroy Hermelaire, wife of Pierre Sarrazin, and both are identified as residents of Santiago de Cuba.
So Cavaillon, Santiago de Cuba, and New Orleans converge on a single page of the cathedral register.
They do.
The priest who served in Cavaillon, who retreated to Cuba, who fled to New Orleans, is baptizing a child whose parents share his precise origin, flanked by godparents representing their shared Cuban interlude.
The continuity is perfect.
But as an investigative team, we have to demand absolute verification.
Of course.
I mean, the name Claude Thomas is not entirely uncommon. How do we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man signing these 1809 registers in Louisiana is the exact same man who penned the 1797 letter in a besieged Caribbean town 12 years earlier?
It's a fair question. We subjected the documents to forensic handwriting analysis.
Okay.
We placed the high-resolution scans of the 1797 manuscript next to the 1809 sacramental registers. We examined the physical ink validation and the biomechanics of the pen strokes.
What did you find?
The 1797 manuscript exhibits a highly educated, idiosyncratic, late 18th century French cursive.
What were the specific markers that confirmed the match?
2 distinct formations confirm the identity. First, observe the lowercase t. The standard period script usually closes the loop. Thomas formed his crayon with an open, counterclockwise ascending stroke that loops back heavily on itself.
Interesting.
Second, and most definitively, is the capital T in his signature.
How does he write it?
He employs a heavily pressed vertical stem with a completely detached, sweeping leftward horizontal crossbar. It looks almost like a ship's mast, separated from its sail.
And that matches.
This precise, unusual formation in the 1797 letter matches the New Orleans signatures perfectly.
Right.
The same hand held the quill.
The handwriting removes any doubt, but there's also a psychological fingerprint in these documents.
Yes.
In every New Orleans document, he signs as ancient curé, former parish priest.
It was not a nostalgic reflection for a lost era in the Caribbean.
What was it then?
It was the strict canonical basis for his authority in an American diocese where he had never been officially ordained by the local bishop.
Oh, so it was a legal anchor?
Exactly. His credentials derived from a jurisdiction that had been wiped off the map, so the word ancient became his legal anchor. He arrived in a diocese that was primed for his specific brand of defiant authority.
Because the St. Louis Cathedral was engaged in an institutional rebellion at that exact moment.
They were. The cathedral was effectively controlled by a Spanish Capuchin friar named Antonio de Sedela, universally known in New Orleans as Père Antoine.
All right, Père Antoine.
But Père Antoine's true power rested on the Marguilliers, the powerful lay vestry board of the congregation.
Let me make sure I grasp the mechanics of this rebellion. This was a system of lay trusteeism, correct?
Yes, exactly.
The congregation, particularly the wealthy planters and merchants, believed that because they funded the construction of the church and paid the salaries, they had the right to select their own spiritual leadership, openly defying Vatican appointments.
That is the essence of lay trusteeism. It functioned like a corporate board of directors resisting a hostile takeover by a parent company in Rome.
And Father Thomas got involved in this.
Father Thomas was immediately absorbed into this inner circle. He and another former friar named John Kuhn became known to the ecclesiastical authorities as Père Antoine's notorious assistance. They actively defied outside governance.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
If this defiant refugee vestry hijacked the cathedral's authority, were they essentially weaponizing the church? Were they using the structural power of the St. Louis Cathedral to formally reconstruct the exact social, financial, and racial hierarchy they had just lost in Saint-Domingue?
The archival evidence points directly to that conclusion.
Really?
Yes. They were creating an institutional fortress. They had experienced a catastrophic loss of their world to revolution. They watched their estates burn and their legal authority vanish.
So they weren't going to let that happen again.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They were ensuring that no external authority, not even a bishop appointed by the Vatican, could dictate the terms of their new sanctuary in Louisiana.
They needed compliance.
They required clergy who understood the necessity of their slave-based economy, who had participated in it, and who would not challenge its moral foundation.
This unified front resulted in a major confrontation in 1815.
It did. The Vatican appointed Bishop Louis William de Bourgh to take charge of the New Orleans diocese.
And how did that go?
When de Bourgh arrived, he found the environment profoundly hostile. It was fiercely protected by this coalition of French Creoles and Saint-Domingue refugees.
They didn't accept him.
They literally blocked the bishop from taking his seat in his own cathedral. The Marguilliers controlled the keys to the physical doors, and they refused to turn them over to de Bourgh.
So a Vatican-appointed bishop is locked out of his own church by a refugee priest and a board of exile planters. What did de Bourgh do?
He retreated.
He gave up.
He traveled 700 miles up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, Missouri in 1818. He administered his massive diocese from exile for years because Father Thomas and the Marguilliers held the cathedral doors shut.
It is a display of entrenched trans-imperial power.
It is. And this brings us to the final thread of our investigation, the ultimate archival discovery that closes the loop on Father Thomas's financial and spiritual entanglements.
Where did we find this final piece?
We return to the LSU archives, specifically to Manuscript Collection 2590.
What did the registers in the LSU archives reveal?
We found copies of 2 further baptismal certificates from the St. Louis Cathedral signed by our subject.
Okay.
On January 24th, 1810, Father Claude Thomas baptizes an infant named Jean-Baptiste Drouillard.
Drouillard, that name again.
2 years later, in 1812, he baptizes Vincent Auguste Drouillard. Both children are the sons of Jean-Vincent Amédée Drouillard.
To understand the weight of these 2 baptisms, we have to map the genealogy of these families one last time, connecting the paper trail back to the beginning of our investigation.
Yes, let's trace the lineage back. We start with Charles Trevet and Suzanne Merson de Belleton in the early 18th century in Saint-Domingue.
Okay.
They had 3 children. The eldest daughter, Françoise Suzanne Tourbet, marries into the Rousseau line.
Right. She is the mother of the Monsieur Rousseau residing in New Jersey, the recipient of the 1797 letter who was tasked with collecting the debt.
Exactly. The second daughter is Marie-Jeanne Tourbet. She marries into the Drouillard family and becomes the formidable widow Vallombrun.
Ah, the matriarch who chartered a ship and actively fought abolitionist lawyers to retain her human property.
Yes, she is the grandmother of Jean-Vincent Amédée Drouillard.
I see.
And the third child, the brother to these 2 women, is Jacques-François Tourbet de Lamar.
He is the very man who owed the 28,264 livres to Father Thomas.
Yes. Therefore, Jean-Vincent Amédée Drouillard, the father of the infants baptized in New Orleans, is the great-nephew of the original debtor from Croix des Bouquets.
And Amédée Drouillard had established himself firmly in Louisiana by this time.
Very firmly. He became a deputy sheriff in New Orleans, actively enforcing the very slave codes his family relied upon to generate wealth, and he operated a sugar plantation utilizing enslaved labor in St. Tammany Parish.
So the exact same priest who managed the financial intimacies of the great-uncle in the besieged plains of Saint-Domingue in 1797, is now standing at the baptismal font in New Orleans in 1810, pouring water over the heads of the great-nephews.
Yes.
An ocean was crossed, an empire burned, a second exile was endured in Cuba, yet the network remained entirely flawlessly intact.
It forces us to reflect on the scope of this journey. We must consider what Father Thomas's specific trajectory reveals about the conclusion of the Haitian Revolution.
Because on a macro-historical level, the physical colony of Saint-Domingue was permanently lost to the European powers.
Right.
Slavery was irrevocably abolished on the island, and the Republic of Haiti was born. That is the undeniable triumph of the revelation.
Absolutely.
You, the listener, have tracked a single piece of heavy rag paper from a fortified, burning town in the Caribbean.
We followed it through the Windward Passage, past French privateers, through a yellow fever quarantine, to the legal borders of a quiet house in New Jersey.
And then we tracked its author, Father Thomas, as he shed his secular title, retreated to Cuba, and finally entrenched himself at the center of Catholic power in the American South.
The physical colony was lost, yet the economic and social code of the plantocracy, its ruthless legal strategies, its capital accumulation, its familial alliances, and its brutal racial hierarchy did not perish in the fires of the cul-de-sac.
It endured.
It was carried across the water by figures exactly like Father Thomas, and it seamlessly re-embedded itself into the fertile soil of antebellum Louisiana.
The severe historical truth of this investigation is that the same highly acidic iron gall ink that chemically burned through the paper of the 1797 letter, the same interconnected families who manipulated the censo credit systems, and the exact same mechanisms of human exploitation successfully crossed the ocean to fund the growth and architecture of a young America.
The institution survived the destruction of its primary headquarters.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over based on these sources. Consider the long-term legal ramifications of this survival for the United States.
Yes.
The property disputes and the fierce institutional defiance initiated by these exiled Marguiliers at the St. Louis Cathedral didn't just frustrate a single bishop in 1815.
No, they certainly did not.
Those disputes festered for decades. The structural conflicts introduced by this deeply entrenched refugee network eventually required the intervention of the United States Supreme Court in the 1840s just to untangle the mess of property rights and ecclesiastical authority in New Orleans.
It's true. The legacy of Saint-Domingue, carried by men who refused to surrender their authority, tested the highest legal institutions of America long after Father Thomas was gone.
It's a dark but essential chapter of history.
Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next episode.